Mozambique is hit by two powerful cyclones in just 6 weeks, and aid workers are struggling to help millions of people. They say not enough money is being pledged. So, is the world ignoring another disaster in Africa, or have donors lost interest in helping? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. Mozambique is reeling from two of the strongest storms ever to hit the country. Aid efforts were already stretched after Cyclone Idai in March, which killed more than 600 people. And then, on Thursday, Cyclone Kenneth made landfall, killing another 38. And the forecast is for more heavy rain, which will worsen the flooding over the next few days. The UN says around 2 million people urgently need drinking water, food and medicine. But international donors have been slow to respond, if at all. One senior UN official says if this happened anywhere else in the world, the response would be very different.
We are in an incredibly difficult situation right now. So the response to Cyclone Idai was just over 25% funded when Tropical Cyclone Kenneth hit. So already we had maxed out everything that we could do with the funding that we had available for Tropical Cyclone Idai. Then we have a new cyclone, and let's be clear, this is not something that is a small addition to an existing crisis. This is a new crisis. If this had have hit anywhere else in the world, it would be a whole new response, and that's how we're treating it here. It needs new funding, and we need that desperately. We need it now.
Let's bring in our guest. Nikolas Finney is on Skype from Pemba, one of the worst hit areas. He is Save the Children's response team leader in Mozambique. In Johannesburg, David Matsinhe, Amnesty International's researcher for Southern Africa. And on Skype from Florence, Mahari Tadele Maru, specialist on peace and security law and governance in Africa. Welcome to you all. I want to begin with you, Nikolas Finney, in Pemba. Clearly, two cyclones in 6 weeks has meant that all of the aid organisations, not just yours, are very stretched. What are your immediate needs right now?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Yeah, this is a really tricky situation. Our immediate needs right now are to respond as quickly as we can with emergency relief materials to those who have been impacted by Cyclone Kenneth, which struck on Thursday. We have to do that without bringing capacity out of the Cyclone Idai response, which is underway in central Mozambique. The cyclone that landed here on Thursday really bulldozed a coastline of northern Mozambique in a place where they're not used to cyclones. People weren't so prepared for this, including the humanitarian community. We've been really stretched to respond so far. First priority, get some emergency shelter materials on the ground. Second priority, get some food on the ground. Third priority, try to create a safe and clean environment for people, but it's taking time. The logistical hurdles are massive at the moment. We've got bad rain, we've had flooding following the cyclone, roads have been blocked, helicopters couldn't fly. I could give you a long list, but maybe I stop there to hear some discussion.
Do you have enough money? Is that a problem for you?
Absolutely not. We didn't even have enough money for Cyclone Idai. The UN appeal for that cyclone stands at 28% of its target currently. This, in comparison to other disasters on a similar scale, means that Mozambique has been hard done by the international community. It's getting less than it deserves, and it's a country that needs a lot of help in this situation. So Cyclone Idai's appeal was already in a bad condition, and we were very worried about meeting the basic needs there. What now needs to happen is, whilst that problem is solved and whilst more money comes in central Mozambique, we're starting up a new operation in response to Cyclone Kenneth. There is no appeal target set by the United Nations yet. That's still being developed, and the floods are still unfolding. So this situation in the north of Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado and Nampula provinces, is evolving by the day.
It is up to the international community to raise all of this. You make the point that the pledging levels haven't been discussed yet. Those targets haven't been assigned yet. I want to bring in Mahari Tadele Maru in Florence here. Mozambique is perhaps unique in all of the countries in Africa, like our guest from Florence said, in that they're not used to this type of disaster hitting that country. However, this is much more than just the type of disaster that's hit the country. There is some sort of donor fatigue that's going on right now. A lot of people are simply overwhelmed by the amount of crises happening in Africa over the amount of years. I mean, we're talking since the 1950s, the international community has been sending aid to Africa, and they're getting very frustrated that there are issues of corruption in various countries, of nepotism, of aid not reaching the right people. How much of this is donor fatigue and how much of it is simply the fact that there isn't the money out there to give to a disaster like this?
Well, thank you for having me. I think clearly this is a disaster, a natural disaster. We have natural disaster elsewhere outside Africa, be it flood or drought. But flood and drought are not automatically turned into days. They don't become days unless governments fail. This is ultimately and central point is that this is a governance failure at most. And the Mozambican government and other governments in Southern Africa are well aware of that natural disaster occur frequently in that part of Africa in the form of flood, like drought in Eastern Africa. And preparation to this in terms of predicting, preventing, responding, and if necessary, adapting to the situation of this kind of disaster would have been proper. This similar disaster has happened 10 years ago, exactly in 2000. And what lessons did we take? How far are we prepared in terms of responding to this? This takes us to the central point that governments ultimately are responsible for these disasters turning into a crisis, a human security crisis, where death and displacement has become normal in this area. The second, of course, is there is international solidarity. The international community has to step in. There are situations when African countries, including Mozambique, will not be able to respond to effectively, even if it has predicted and tried to prevent some of the disasters and even the deaths, then it could be beyond its capacity. The African Union and other international organizations, the UN and international community has to show the solidarity. Unfortunately, the level of solidarity is at its lowest for the past decades. Why? Partly because countries are inward-looking. They are in turmoil, political turmoil. They are not supporting multilateral organizations. They are not supporting the founding or the underpinning of multilateralism and solidarity. You can see the European Union or the US, which is in its own internal crisis. They are at most interested in containing migration at any cost. They are putting a lot of money on migration. Why wouldn't they put similar level of attention for disasters of this kind, which could be beyond the capacity of the countries?
Let's bring in David Matsinhe here from Johannesburg. David, you've been listening to both our guests there. A number of years ago, I was speaking to somebody from the Department for International Development, the British organisation that helps foreign countries, and there was an enormous amount of frustration that a lot of the money that they were giving seemingly was disappearing, and there was a number of cases of corruption being brought against many places in Africa. Has that had an impact on donors giving aid? Is there a frustration that actually the aid might not be getting to the people that need it most, that it might just be disappearing into the coffers of the very rich?
Unfortunately, the behavior of the Mozambican government has not necessarily inspired confidence in the international community, among donors in particular. It also has not inspired confidence in Mozambique among its own citizens. We can recall recently the former Minister of Finance in Mozambique was arrested in South Africa with an arrest warrant by the United States in the wake of the 2.2 billion scandal of secret debts, illegal debts that were contracted without the permission of the parliament, which is what the Constitution requires. So unfortunately, the government has not inspired confidence. And if you are familiar with the media in Mozambique, there isn't a single day that passes without stories of misappropriation of funds from donors, also from the taxpayers, without those stories coming into the surface. So unfortunately, that is the reality. That's what's going on in Mozambique. The other thing that I would like to add here in this conversation are the pre-existing conditions prior to the arrival of these natural disasters. If we take a look at Cabo Delgado, Cabo Delgado is the province with the highest rate of mud houses and other structures built on precarious material. We also have large portions of the population isolated in villages that are not easy to reach. It's very difficult, to cover, the areas in rural areas because there's no infrastructures, the roads are poor, the telecommunication systems are poor, and you also have to keep in mind that the epicenter of this disaster in Cabo Delgado is exactly in the areas where, the extremist attacks have been taking place and where the government has been prohibiting the media and journalists from reaching out and report on what's going on. So the information is trickling in, but I can guarantee you that there's a lot of destruction, a lot of death probably, and injury that has taken place that we still don't know because the government hasn't been allowing the media and journalists to go to these areas to report on what's going on.
Nikolas, Finney and Pemba, let me just bring you in here. Nikolas, we've heard a lot of, there is the government restricting this. There are African governments that perhaps aren't doing themselves any favours by restricting the media, by not putting attention on it, and by not dealing with this nepotism and this corruption that seems to plague any natural disaster that happens. And that's a real issue. But I just want to ask you this question. Where are we at when it comes to international donors? Clearly, there is money. If you take a look at the case of Notre Dame in France, when that burnt down, within days, billions of dollars were raised through the private sector for that particular disaster. Yet here we are in Africa, another disaster. People foresaw it. It could have been managed much more better, yet the money isn't there.
Absolutely. And I want to just also come back to one of the points that the second speaker made. Clearly Mozambique has been affected by flood and cyclone disasters in the past, and there is some level of preparedness there. But let's just be clear on what's just happened in the last 2 months. 6 weeks ago, Mozambique was hit by the strongest cyclone ever to hit a country in the southern hemisphere in terms of historical records. Last Thursday, they were hit again by what is now leapfrogging the last one as the strongest cyclone ever to hit a country in the southern hemisphere. So we're talking about superlatives. We're not talking about a regular occurrence that should be run-of-the-mill for a government to prepare and respond to, whatever the state of the government services generally. We're talking about an unprecedented disaster which has not been seen on recent historical record before. And we've got to ask ourselves, is this climate change in action? The climate scientists would say, well, one of the predictions would be that there might not be more cyclones, but they might be stronger and they might strike out of the normal season. And they might also strike in different places. That's exactly what's happened here in Cabo Delgado. And I hope the scientific community can draw a conclusion on this very soon. what
Mahari
we've seen
in Florence, and let me bring you in. Let me bring you in here, Mahari in Florence. We've heard there that there are a number of reasons why this has taken place and why it's unprecedented, both climate change and the fact that the government has actually failed. But it's a bit more than that, though, isn't it? There is a frustration on behalf of the donors to give money to African countries because they feel that they are corrupt, that the money isn't getting there. There is an issue here, isn't there?
Yes, I think there is, in my opinion. Let's put it in terms of levels of responsibility. There is no question that the issue of accountability of the government, both in terms of access to media, in terms of where you have a better accountability, we know from history, be it extreme weather droughts that cause famine in hundreds of thousands, if in some cases of millions of people affected in different parts. Where you have accountable government, at least the issues, the problems, the difficulties are announced, and also the international community takes care of that in terms of putting at least the attention on the crisis and the disaster. Now, in this case, we don't have that kind of even preparation and openness. And without that kind of media coverage, the government even announcing this ahead of time, immediately after this crisis happens, then you have a problem. Now, that being said, the international community is not a community in the sense that we had some years ago even. The issue of solidarity to countries, be it on climate change based solidarity, that we have a lot of negotiation that has happened, and all this negotiation is about human security affected by climate change. And this is an example where the international community also utterly fails. And the comparisons you make with the different kind of readiness to support different challenges is there. I mentioned one case of migration. You mentioned the Notre Dame fire and how the international community reacted to this. You don't have that. It's a level of double standard. It shows the solidarity that we talk about, and the international community also declares that it stands for is not working to a large extent. But ultimately, let me say this one. There might be, if the Mozambique, this was something that is beyond Mozambique's government totally, and that the Mozambican government has done its best, there wouldn't have been this kind of strong criticism on the Mozambican government. That the criticism would have been on the international.
Let me bring in David Matsinhe here. Is this then a combination of racism towards African countries and frustration with African governments?
It's difficult to tell, whether we're talking about the problem of racism. But let us consider a few other factors here. There's been a narrative of Africa rising, and in that narrative, there is the story of Africa that is rich in mineral resources, Africa that is attracting international direct investment. And in the case of Mozambique, we clearly see that story being played out, every day. Cabo Delgado is rich in mineral resources. There's lots of multinational corporations investing a lot of money in that area. And yet the end result isn't local people who actually own the resources benefiting from this. So there's been a big narrative all over the world of Africa now being able to ensure that it can develop itself economically and socially by using its natural resources. I personally think that could be factored into these donor fatigue. The other thing is there's a race among some of our African governments to declare themselves as middle-income countries, when in fact, when you look at the reality on the ground, those countries do not qualify to be declared as middle-income countries. It's a status symbol to be a middle-income country. And when governments do this, they're actually contributing to the denial of rights of their own people, because the international community gets a wrong impression that everything is going well, when actually on the ground things are not going well, when journalists are not allowed to do their work to inform the international community, to inform the world and the donors about what's really happening on the ground. So here we clearly have the role of African governments, in this particular case, Mozambican government, that is contributing, in my view, in actually hiding what's going on, and in that way denying people the opportunity to get their rights taken care of and protected, not only by the government, but also by the international community.
Nikolas Finney, would you agree with that? Would you agree that the Mozambique government isn't helping and that it's actually hindering your efforts?
You've gone for a macro level picture of what's going on. Let me tell you the reality of what's happening here right now. The government, the United Nations, humanitarian organizations like Save the Children, local private sector, international private sector are working together to save lives. These considerations are very much at the back of our thoughts right now. We need support to put emergency materials on the ground to prevent loss of life. Cabo Delgado has a number of issues. One of them is that cholera is endemic. Another is that malaria is endemic. If we can't mobilize the right kind of response to this cyclone, where international cooperation is happening, then what is it all about? You know, I'd like to inject some humanity into the debate here. I don't really, you know, deny or argue with the points that have been made. But what's happening right now is that we're working together across government, international community, and business, and we're trying to get a job done, and we need more help.
There's an impassioned plea there from Nikolas Finney in Pemba. The situation is dire and they do need money. But I do come back to the original point, and I want to bring Mahari in here from Florence. There's donor fatigue, there's frustration, there's anger, and there is corruption in African governments. All of that feeds into what Nikolas Finney was saying. Yes, we do need money right now. This is a big problem, but there are structural problems here that have been caused over decades, surely.
I completely agree that the issue for now, in terms of short term, is the humanitarian response. The focus has to be to save lives as much as possible, as many lives as possible, to save livelihood and assets of the communities, including infrastructures and so on. This is clear. I think in the short run, the main focus and mobilization of resource has to happen towards effective humanitarian response. And that is something that we should support. And the international community has been called upon, and it has to respond effectively to this. While doing that one, without undermining the humanitarian response that is required, to get out of similar kind of problems from happening in the near future, the governments in Africa has to clean their house. They have to be held accountable. And that's where there is irresponsiveness from the African government side. Ultimately, disasters become days when the vulnerability is high, livelihoods are significantly affected, and these are reflection of the socio-economic development of countries. You don't see this number of deaths when flood happens in Australia. The reason is there is responsible government that is held accountable. It's not corrupt as much as the African countries. And within African countries, there are countries that have improved significantly because they have introduced responsibility as important element in their humanitarian system.
I'm afraid we are out of time now. I would like to just thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our guests, Nikolas Finney, David Matsinhe, and Mahari Tadele Maru. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.